Good morning. Hello, Moritz. Can you hear me?
Can hear you very well. Good morning, Eric.
So thank you for the paper. Thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to discuss this very impressive paper. Have you seen? So can you see the slides? So as you have seen, I mean, this paper builds on an impressive data collection.
There already. It's good.
There. Good. Wonderful. Thank you. Of the central bank's balance sheet. So of the 17 advanced economies since the late 19th century, which are also in the Jordan Schuller-Taylor database, and also some central banks in the earlier period, so before the 19th century. The paper is really illuminating in a way that it makes us understand the relationship between the central bank's balance sheets and the financial systems, or mostly the banking system, in several ways. So the first point, which I think is very nice graph that Maurice have shown, this is the idea that actually if you scale the central bank balance sheet by the size of the banking systems, we are not in uncharted or unprecedented times. Actually, it's just because the banking system today is bigger than ever, than the central bank's balance sheets are very high, which obviously connects a lot with previous work by Maurice, showing this great leveraging and the increase in the size of financial systems. So here, it's very interesting to have these big pictures, and it's in a way sometimes implicit in the paper, but if you read this paper with the perspective of other works by Maurice, then it all makes sense, and it's very interesting to assess the role of central banks today. The second thing is that, so in this long history, central banks have expanding their balance sheets many times to different types of shock, but it's really recent that very systematically it's been in response to financial crisis time. So it's really in the 1990s that clearly the response to financial crisis dominates to explain the expansions of central banks' balance sheets. And the third view on that is really like this, as they show, I mean, these liquidity injections by central banks have an impact on macroeconomic variables, but it also increases moral hazard, which I think is very strong results for political economy discussions on central banks. Just a last point on this, having also some experience of working with historical central banks balance sheets, I was very pleased, and I think it's something that really need to be emphasized because it's very difficult, and the authors did that, is that one main difficulty is when you deal with these balance sheets, that these balance sheets can expand for many reasons unrelated to monetary policy actions. You know, it can be, for example, revaluation. For example, if you have a devaluation or revaluation of the exchange rate, then it moves the international reserves. It can be because central banks are managing assets for other institutions like the Norwegian funds, for example, pension funds. So these are very difficult things when you deal with historical balance sheet, and the author did great care to take back into account, which I think is very, very valuable. And I get that it was a lot of work. So I will make some. So I will make a couple of comments and suggestions. So the first one, which is very kind of minor, but is important for historians, that is a way to deal with pre-19th century central banks, because there is all this recent literature summarized by Vell, Roberts, and Binsell, where they show that actually, according to some definitions, there were much central banks that we usually consider before the 19th century. And here you stand a little bit in the middle between the old literature and the new ones, meaning that you take around 10 central banks and not the 55 that Roberts and Vell and Binsell identified in their study. So it will definitely not change the main results of the paper, but I think it's still important, especially in the first graph of the paper, that the way you present your historical balance sheets. For example, for Italy, you are able to take into account only 3 central banks, but if you take the 5 or 6 that are identified in this literature, and if you scale by the Italian GDP for the 17th century, it will make a difference, okay? So not big difference, and not of your main result will be affected by that, but I still think it will be important for the presentation. So it was very short comment, is a list by Binsell. So second suggestions, really more on the identification and your strategy to focus on this governor ideology. I think the whole question behind that is who is really taking decisions, you know, who decides. So your assumption here that it's really the main governor who is taking the decisions, but there are, you know, maybe argument that it's not always true. So you discuss some of them, but maybe not all of them. So the first one is that in some cases, and we can discuss that further, but it could be the case for Labéry that you mentioned, is that actually other board members are more influential. Okay, it's not, so this is all the political economy that you can appoint a board member, just political reasons, but you know that actually some other will be more influential. The second one is that decisions are maybe taken by the government, not the central bank. So for example, one example I have in mind is if you look at Spain in the late 19th century, so the central bank is independent in terms of some de jure criteria, it's a private central bank, but it's been shown in all the literature on the Spanish central bank in the late 19th century that for 20 years, it's all completely ruled by the government. So you take that a little bit into account in your estimations because you control for a dummy for central bank independence, but it's only a de jure measure. And I think that your narrative analysis could help you to take more into account, de facto relationship between the government and the central bank. The third criteria really applies to the central banks whose decision actually had been decentralized. And here, for example, you refer to you cite this paper by Richardson and Trust on the Federal Reserve during the Great Depression. And on one hand, it's true that it supports your point in identification because Richardson and Trust, they compare the Atlanta Fed and the St. Louis Fed during the Great Depression, and they show because of the different ideologies of governor, there are different actions for lender of last resort during the Great Depression. So on this point, it really supports your argument. But it also shows that for one central bank, actually you can have diverse reactions in because it's a system. And the Federal Reserve is not the only case in point. I mean, if you in the 19th century, there were still many central banks functioning like that. I mean, Sweden, for example, even Italy until the 1920s. So here again, I think it's not very so difficult because you have already so much information in narrative analysis that you could take that into account and include these criteria in your discussion, both the narrative discussion and maybe also the estimations. So on the third comment is more on the mechanisms, the channels that you identify when you run these local projections, where you measure the effect of the central bank expansion on the economy. So here, I was not sure that you can really distinguish between the liquidity support that we usually identify as a lender of last resort operation, that they are providing money usually to individual banks. We are really need that. And the expansionary monetary policy, or even sometimes credit policy, in response to the economic crisis, which is itself caused by the banking crisis. And these are different tools because in the first case, this will be individual loans to central banks. In the second case, for example, it can be like asset purchases or so. Again, maybe it will not change the effect that you estimate, the macroeconomic effect, but to understand the channels, it could be good whether you could try to identify these two different channels. So there are many examples in history of that. Again, if you think about the Fed, I mean, in 1932, they have this open market program, which is an expansion of the balance sheet, but it's not lender of last resort in itself. And many cases like so. The question here I had, it was not so clear in your appendix what kind of data, exactly detailed data you have on the assets, whether you will be able, for example, to distinguish between the loans, individual loans, and asset purchases to distinguish these two channels. And these two channels, I mean, not only they matter to understand the economic effect of central bank expansions, but they may also matter for your identification when you talk about a governor's ideology. I think it's very sensible to think that the same people can be very dovish, for example, on the banking sectors, because sometimes they come from the banking sectors, so they have no problem with moral hazard and so on, but very hawkish on monetary policy stance. Okay, so these guys, for example, will be okay with lending to banks, but not so much expanding the asset purchases, for example. And you have example of this. I mean, Montague Norman, for example, on banking million, even Tricia. I would put Tricia in this category. It would raise maybe discussions here, but I think on this. And again, if you could separate between these two, which will mean refine your identification of governor ideology, if it works, it will actually strengthen your first stage, because here you may mix two different kinds of acting. The last comment, which is again on the identification of moral hazard, is that if we So if we believe your identification, I mean, the main ID, so that if you say that you can identify from sources, you say this might be public information, because otherwise it would be very difficult to identify whether a governor is dovish or hawkish, because you want to go beyond personal characteristics. And you already emphasize that. I think you're right that your identification really is, the whole point is to say, it's not only about, education, experience, professional experience, and so on. This is really about ideology, that you cannot only explain that these kinds of objective variables. So it needs to be visible, and you identify it in the press and newspapers and so on. But if it's true, I mean, this information was also accessible to the banking sector itself. So it means that the banking sectors will know if the governor is very dovish, so if it can act and respond more to the banking crisis by lending on leverage funds. So the banking sector can internalize, I mean, the moral hazard problems, because they will know how the central banks would react. So the problem with that is that it's very difficult to identify the bias, because on one hand you could say, okay, but so it will increase moral hazard, it will increase risk taking for the banking sector during the crisis. So maybe actually it's very bad, it will have a negative effect, but it can also have a positive effect if you think that at the end increasing risk may make the banking sector maybe bigger or more diversified. So you control for that. You have a way to control for that in the appendix when you look at the pre-trend, but you can only look at the evolution of total assets of banking sectors and not the composition of assets. So if you think about the subprime crisis, for example, it's not only about the size, of course, of the banking sectors, but the type of asset. So maybe one way, I mean, my suggestions to tackle this issue will be to distinguish between the financial crises, which have domestic factors, domestic reasons, and the ones that are more caused by international contagion. So then you could limit, the cases where actually it's just like the banking sectors internalize the fact that there is a dovish governor that would be more easy to banks during the crisis. So on the conclusion, so indeed what your paper very nicely show is that the central banks also, they played the role of a lot of last resorts in the 17th century. This role has expanded with the size of financial system and became very unprecedented since in the last 30 years. So there's really something clearly new in the job of central banks today, which is related to the new role of the financial system more generally in the economy. And I think only a long run perspective can show that so clearly. So it's and it raises a question. I mean, you could maybe reformulate your results in terms of, what is this term financial dominance, which is also used in this literature. And if you go to this idea of financial dominance, that at the end, some central banks are in some ways central banks' action are driven by the interest of the financial system. It raises the usual debate on people arguing, whether it's financial dominance or fiscal dominance, because we also live in a world where there is this very strong nexus between the financial systems and the public debt management, because at the end, it's the banks that own the debt. So the governments also need a well-functioning financial system. So at the end, I think it's still an open question for your interpreting your result of whether this is driven only by the expansion of financial systems or by the new political economy relationship between the government and the financial systems. So last point, I will push even more, I think, your results on the moral hazards. First, because actually it does not even require causal identification. And even if people do not fully believe in your causal identification strategy, I mean, the results here are pretty clear that if you have a very high central banking expansions, then it raises the probability of a crisis, banking crisis, few years later. And you can disentangle a little bit more these results, looking at, the different action that was taken during the crisis. And the last question, which is more an introduction to the next paper by Chris, and actually I'm the co-author, and is that, at the end, where is the political economy here in your paper? Because it's more ideology of governor, but do you think that the same people with the same ideology in a different context will act differently? Thank you.